Y'all can hear me, right? Good deal. Still in the Psalms. We're in Psalm 33 today. And, we driving up here, some unfortunate individual that just had to be somewhere at 90 miles an hour blew past us on Block 17 Road out here. Yeah. And it was just this cloud of yellow. And you could see the pollen in the air as we're driving through it. And then they just dumped a fresh load of coal dust out of that conveyor. And so you had coal dust right there. And so we drove through the coal dust, and then we drive through the pollen, which the car's already yellow anyways. That's... you don't see that growing up at the beach. The wind and stuff would blow the pollen away. So being up here, that's kind of a different thing. But I don't think I've ever seen that much when the air wake from the truck driving by us blew up and the pollen just...
They go in and out of our road and we can see it just pouring off the back of the big trucks.
Yeah, be glad for that rain that comes through tonight. Knock some of that down. But yeah, even through all of that, right, it can be difficult to see, and through the clouds and all the dust gets in our way, and just everything that gets in our way. And life is like that for us because we can have things that distract us and trouble us and give us issues. And in the military, they call it the cloud of war. You get out there on the battlefield and everybody's shooting, and you got all the smoke from all the guns and the stuff blowing up, and it's hard to make out who's your friend and who's your enemy and where your target is and that kind of thing. But the one thing that we know in life that always stays constant is what David is telling. Hopefully it's David. There's nothing to say this is David, but some psalmist back here was talking about the steadfast love of the Lord. So no matter what we're doing in our lives, no matter where we are, what we're dealing with, God's love is steadfast. And we use that a lot in the Bible. We use that word a lot. We don't use it so much in regular everyday conversation. To be steadfast, to be rooted, to be permanent, to be something that when the wind blows, when that truck passes you by, the wind from the truck passing you by doesn't blow you off the road because you're there. It might blow the dust around, but you're still there. And so to be steadfast, to be anchored, to be solid, and that's an idea that runs all through the Bible. Whether they're talking about being like a mighty oak, we talked about the cedar trees at Lebanon a few weeks ago. A good solid tree has a good solid deep root system that will hold it in place, and it will be steadfast. And that's the way the Lord is. The Lord is always there, and the Lord is always steadfast in his love, in his character. But we're looking at the steadfast love of the Lord, Psalm 33. And so starting out verse 1. Shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous. Praise befits the upright. Give thanks to the Lord with the lyre. Make melody to him with the harp of 10 strings. Sing to him a new song. Play skillfully on the strings with loud shouts. For the word of the Lord is upright, and all his work is done in faithfulness and justice. Verse 5, he loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the steadfast love of the Lord. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap, and he puts the deep in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the peoples. The counsel of the Lord stands forever. the plans of his heart to all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all the children of man. From where he sits enthroned, he looks out on all the inhabitants of the earth. He who fashions the hearts of them all and observes all their deeds. The king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a false hope for salvation, and by its great might it cannot rescue. Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive in famine. Verse 20, our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart is glad in him, because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, ever as we hope in you. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you, dear Lord, for your steadfast love. We just thank you for the anchor that you provide through all of our trials and tribulations, dear Lord, through all of our storms. We know that we can always turn to you, dear Lord, when we have issues, because you are steadfast, because you are unchanging and unwavering. And we just ask that you be with us in the service today, dear Lord. Open our hearts and our minds. Be with those not here, dear Lord, that should be, and just touch their hearts. Go before us, dear Lord, as we go after you to help further your kingdom, as we bring people to you, not just to this church, dear Lord, but to you specifically, first and foremost. And be with us as we try to go about your business here. We ask for all this in Jesus' precious name. So, it's Baptist churches, which I didn't grow up in one, but I've heard enough to know that, drums were not allowed at one point, and some of these verses gotta, like, well, look here, he says use stringed instruments only, right? But when you look and you study all throughout, there's actually a whole number of instruments. But regardless, whatever we do, if we're going to do it for the Lord, do it for the Lord. Do it as unto the Lord. And and there's churches out there that tell you no music, can't have any music of any kind. And I'm okay. I don't know how they do hymns unless they just do everything a cappella. Which we get another piano player and maybe a few more people that can play some other instruments. But regardless of how we do it, it's got to be done unto the Lord, and it's got to be correct, right? So the psalmist is instructing the righteous. Verse 1 there, shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous, praise befits the upright. So upright and righteous can be interchanged there. And to be upright is to be honest and to have integrity. And those are qualities for sure that God tells us that we need to have in our day-to-day dealings. But what does it mean to be righteous? And this is something we often, I think, we get wrong. And we don't do it just in church. We do it everywhere. We do it to politicians, everybody else. We want you to be perfect. I'm going to put you up there, and you're going to be up there, and you better be perfect in your leadership and everything. But we know that they're not. We clearly know David's not perfect. We know all the kings of Judah and all the kings of Israel were not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. It's you look at all the great heroes in the Bible, and there's only a handful that have no flaws. And so the majority of the people who serve God have flaws, and you and I have flaws, and none of us are perfect. So what does it mean then to be righteous? And it means to be right with God, not just to be upright as someone who has integrity and that kind of thing, but someone who is right with God. And while David may not necessarily have written this psalm, we know that David was considered to be a man after God's own heart, yet we know all of his failures. Well, at least we know the major ones. He probably had other failures, but these were certainly the biggest ones that showed up in what's recorded of his life and in the history of Israel. But the key difference, and I've said this before, the key difference between him and everybody else was, and what made him a man after God's own heart to be considered to be one of the greatest kings that Israel ever had, was that he repented. And he took responsibility for his failures, for his sins. And so to be righteous is not to be perfect, but it's to be willing to take responsibility. That's what's missing throughout society as a whole today, including within the churches. So many people don't want to take responsibility for their own actions. And, everybody wants to point a finger at somebody else. And we saw that in the garden, right? God came down and said, "What'd y'all do?" And Adam's like, "Well, that woman you gave me." So he blamed God, and then Eve standing there. Well, she couldn't blame God, so she blamed the serpent, right? Well, that serpent over there, of course, serpent's going, "Well, where's that darn platypus?" But so right from the get-go, they're avoiding responsibility for their sins, for the actions that they took. I mean, yeah, she was, somebody was whispering in her ear, but she still chose to partake of that piece of fruit, right? So those of us who are righteous, and it's, praise befits the upright, we need to acknowledge people who are righteous. It's not that we need to worship them. We don't need to overblow it. You don't need to go so far as to become arrogant and big-headed about the whole thing. But the people who are righteous, that's who we need to look to for leadership. That's who we need to look to for mentorship. That's who we need to look to say, how can we be like them? And so they're going to be people. And when you stop and think about that, who's the person at work that everybody wants to be like? Or, who's that leader that everybody wants to follow? Usually it's the person with the most integrity, the person who's most upright. So if we're upright, if we're righteous people, if we're right with God, then what are we going to do? We're going to sing praises to the Lord. And so, that's from verse 2 and 3. Take up these different instruments and let's sing to the Lord. Let's play unto the Lord. Let's worship God. And kind of the flip side of that is, if you don't want to worship God, are you really righteous? So if you are righteous, you're going to worship the Lord. If you don't want to worship the Lord, are you righteous or not? Now, you might have a moment. And again, we see David having his moments, and he wants to whine and complain, and he wants to cry about his problems, but by the time he's done letting it all out, he swings back around to, but God is still there. God is steadfast. God is always there for us. And verse 4, the word of the Lord is upright. The devil questioned God's word in the beginning, and we've been doing that ever since. And we have people today that will sit there and tell you that the Bible is the primary, number one, I don't know if it's necessarily the only book, but the Bible is the most heavily criticized book, and it's the only one I ever hear of where people read it and go, it doesn't mean what it says. How crazy is that? You have 4,000 years of testimony recorded in this book, in these books put together in one big book. And it hasn't changed. When we do new translations, with NIV, ESV, HCSB, what NLT, pick all whatever alphabet you want to put together. And when people do these translations, they don't go, let's translate the King James into English. They kind of did with the New King James, but they still, even in that case, they still went back to the original scrolls, the original Hebrew and the original Greek. So it's consistent. So the Bible says the same thing, has said the same thing for 4,000 years. Obviously, some stuff was written, New Testament, the Gospels themselves were probably written later in the 1st century, but the epistles, those were all being written certainly right after Christ's death, and then the book of Acts leading into the churches. Those epistles were being written before the Gospels. Either way, you still have stuff that hadn't changed in 2,000 years. But I love this in verse 6 from the psalmist. Now, when you think about where David is, so it was 1,500 years from the garden to the flood. It was almost another 500 to the Tower of Babel. There was another several hundred. So we're talking about halfway through recorded history is the point where they're roughly somewhere around 3,000 years after the garden, right? Maybe even a little bit, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years. And so they're sitting here talking about the creation, quoting and bringing up book of Genesis here, verse 6, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. Now, all their hosts, let's think about when we learn in Revelation that Satan and 1/3 of the heavenly hosts were kicked out, right? So the hosts are the angels that were made. So all of creation, God made the heavens, and then this is not, he was already in heaven. So when it says the heavens, we have three of them. We have the regular air, we have space, and then we have outside of space and time, which is where God is, right? That's the third heaven. So, it's not that there's multiple universes or anything weird like that. This is just the different atmospheres, if you want to put it in modern terms. But again, God spoke it and it happened, right? So we're acknowledging God's creation. He gathers the waters at the sea as a heap, and he puts the deep in storehouses. When you see the term sea, especially in Hebrew, but you see this a lot in Revelation in Greek, is it doesn't necessarily refer to actual water. They might use that word, but the context of it could be a group of people. So the masses, he puts the waters of the sea as a heap. That might be referring to the flood, but either way, he takes, and I'm thinking this is actually more dealing with people. And he puts the deeps in storehouses, so he's going to take and store up the righteous. And he's going to save the righteous for a certain time, right? That time being in heaven with him. So, there's that assurance. If you're right with God, then you're going to be preserved. You're going to be stored. You're going to be saved up. And we actually see stuff like that in Revelation. When you go into Revelation and all the saints are under the throne of God. They're waiting. Hey, come on, God, when are you going to go down and deal with your enemies for doing what they did to us, right? Now, this is not Revelation related necessarily, but that's the idea, I believe, there in verse 7. Verse 8, let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm. We need to be reminded of that so frequently. That we need to fear God. That's the beginning of all wisdom. And then we need to work from there, right? And if we're going to acknowledge God, if we're going to fear God, we're going to do his commandments. We're going to obey his commandments. It means we're going to end up being righteous people, and we're going to be upright. And our problems in life come when we ignore God, when we would deny his word, when we deny him and his blessing, when we deny the righteousness by his standard. The world's standard is completely different than God's standard. And there will come a time when every knee shall bow, right? But again, we just need to remind you, this is the guy who created everything. And so if God created you, he can end you for sure. And I love these next several verses because we think we have so much power and we think we're so strong. And we see this in the governments. And I was watching a reel last night or this morning, and it was all these people who mocked God, and then they turn around and they're dead. And it's just this list after list of politicians and so-called performers and athletes. We don't need God, or this whatever, and then they're dead the next day or shortly thereafter. And it's just amazing to see people. And I'm not saying God killed these people. You don't know exactly from incident to incident, but God certainly allowed for these things to happen after they mocked him. But verse 10, the Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the people. All these United Nations, it's going to fail one day. Just like the League of Nations failed right after World War II, World War I, II in that area, which led to us having the United Nations. And we see all the stuff that our government's exposing right now. All the corruption that's in there. And it's like, wow, none of that has anything to do with God. So none of that's coming from that righteous place. But their plans are going to fail ultimately, even if they have temporary success, and they will eventually, right? We read Revelation, we know there's going to be a one world government, one world currency, and all that jazz. So we know they're going to have some little bit of success, but ultimately, Christ does what? He comes down and defeats them. And then sets up his throne. And he sets up his government. So we know no matter what man does, however long it might last, and every great empire in the world, every great nation, never lasts more than about 250 years. Unfortunately, America's right at that point. But you go back and look through the every major, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Roman Empire, all of them, you study all of them, never any of them have ever lasted more than 250 years. Some have lasted less than that. So we know from history. Now, the psalmist didn't have all that history. He didn't even know what was coming after him. But the only nation to truly survive more than 250 years really is the nation of Israel. And that's been up and down for them. But we do know eventually, again, to look at Revelation, and Christ will have his millennial reign, and Israel will be a nation for 1,000 years, longer than anybody else. But verse 11, the counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations. God's word and God's will is eternal. Ours is not. Everything man tries to do is temporary, is what I just said. But God's is not temporary. And I love this verse 12, and I know I always only use the first half of it, and it's directly speaking to Israel, but as a whole, I think we can take some blessing from that if we have our nation focused on God. But verse 12 blesses the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. Like I said, we know America's going to join the other nations of the world and fail at some point. But God's kingdom will be eternal. And so even as Christians, we're to be, everybody wants to have all this big debate about Christian nationalism. It tells us, the Bible tells us, whatever nation you're in, obey the laws of wherever you are unless those laws contradict God. If those laws go against God, then you don't obey them. And we see that out of Jesus and his disciples. And of course, you look back in history at this time when the psalm was written, Israel was nation of the Lord, and all the other ones were pagan nations. And when Israel did things right by God and did the things that God told them to do the way he told them to do it, what happened to them? They were blessed. So if we make our purposes God's purpose, if we take God's purposes and make them our own and work to further his kingdom, we're going to be blessed in doing that. May not be blessed right now and right here, but when all is said and done, when we stand before him in heaven, he'll be able to look at us and say, well done, my good and faithful servant. And we need to remind people of this that try to do everything in the dark. The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all the children of man. And that's an interesting statement there in verse 13, the children of man. He's not saying children of God. He's saying children of man. That's a reference to basically pagans and Gentiles. So all these people that think that they're going to be able to get away with what they're doing, and they're going to make all these plans in secret. God knows what they're doing.
That's right.
And we talk about the Lamb's Book of Life. Well, there's also another book that's full of people's sins. And all that's going to be presented to these people to their face when they stand before the great white throne of Christ. So he's looking down from heaven, right? Verse 14. He's looking down from heaven at everybody on earth. Verse 15, he who fashions the hearts of them all and observes all their deeds. If you let God lead your heart, everybody wants to say, well, let conscience be your God. I hope and pray it's a Christian conscience. Paul was out slaughtering Christians and persecuting Christians, and his conscience said that was a good thing to do. Until Jesus came and corrected it, right? So if we're not letting God influence our decisions, then our conscience is not to be our guide. Because that's going to lead you down all kinds of troubled roads and problems. I love this verse 16. The king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a false hope for salvation, and by its great might it cannot rescue. Modern warfare was greatly changed when they developed the stirrup and applied it to a saddle for riding horses, so you could actually control. Now, there's a way to ride bareback, but you don't have near as much control over the horse. And when the armies, when they finally figured out how to and developed the stirrup, because it started out as like a little toe loop, actually. So barefoot people put their toes in it. And then it was somewhere, I want to say it was one of the Muslim nations figured out to make them out of metal. And it worked its way up into Europe and all that. But that's one of the reasons the Ottoman Empire had such success in building their empire, is because they mastered the war horse. And so, kings and soldiers, no matter how strong you are, and you see the guys in the gym, guys and girls, and they work out and they get super strong, but you still cut them and they still bleed. The human body was not designed for warfare. When you look at the archangels and the different messengers, and when you get into Revelation and you see these angels come down, they're going to fight, and you see the way they're described. Now, some of them are really weird and nothing but eyeballs and wings and whatever, but there's other ones that have armor. There's other ones that have very thick skin. They were designed for battle. They were designed to have the ability to fight. Humans are not like that. We're fragile. No matter how strong we might be, no matter who's pursuing the so-called super soldier, Captain America, right? He was one of my favorite characters. Between him and Superman, those are two of my favorites. I like Captain America better than Superman, though. But anyways, even for all the super soldier serum, he was eventually killed in the comics. They sniper assassinated him. He could still die. And that's part of our problem. And we love to go into battle. We love to fight on our human side of things, on our sinful nature side of things. We love the conflict, and we think we're all big and bad and strong. And governments, the leaders, kings and presidents and the prime ministers, everybody think that if they have a big, strong army, that nothing can defeat them, nothing can take them down. There's plenty of kings of Israel that thought that they're big, old, powerful. Matter of fact, go back and look at Nebuchadnezzar. Go back to the book of Daniel. And you look at Nebuchadnezzar. God raised him up and raised that nation up to help discipline Israel. And Nebuchadnezzar was one of the strongest kings on earth at the time. And he was still taken down by God. And he eventually still died. And even his descendants died. And they could be defeated. And the Medo-Persians and all those people came in and took over Babylon. So the king is not saved by his army. A warrior is not saved by their strength. A war horse is a false hope for salvation. We get out there in tanks today. The war horse has been replaced by armored trucks and tanks. And of course, nowadays we have aircraft. Even the A-10 Warthog, one of the most just absolutely amazing aircrafts they've ever built and designed, titanium tub, basically, with big engines on the back of it, that have had wings blown off, and they still fly back to base. I mean, awesome. But they can still be shot down. As great of an aircraft as it is, it can still be shot down. And it does happen. So we can't rely on our own resources. We can't rely. Think about it, when even at Israel at their peak, if they didn't do things right by God and didn't take the ark out in front of them, they lost every battle. So verse 18, behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him and on those who hope in his steadfast love, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive in famine. Yeah, I mean, you had the history of Israel, right? And Joseph gets sold into slavery, ends up in Egypt, becomes number 2 guy, and was able to save his father and save the nations of Israel. So it's because he stayed faithful to God, right? Maintained his uprightness, his integrity. He was righteous even though he was working in a foreign land for foreign people. But I love that verse 19, that he may deliver their soul from death. God's the only one that can do that. There's nothing that we can do, even if they somehow actually figured out how to transfer consciousness into a computer. How long is that computer going to last? That really is, that's one of the things that they're trying to do right now, is they're trying to live forever through computers. And what the problem with that is souls can't be transferred into a computer. You die in your physical body, your soul goes on up to be dealt with by God, one way or the other. And there are people who will sit there and say, well, I'm going to live forever in virtual reality. That's just a copy. That's an algorithmic copy of whatever you feed into it. Whatever posts you put on social media, whatever stuff you record. They take all that and assign that to whatever avatar thing, so you can think you're talking to the person who just died. In reality, it's just a copy of them. It's not the true person, because the soul's gone on to be judged. But there's people that don't believe in God, or don't think that God has the willingness or the power to do what he says he's going to do. But if we put our faith and our trust in him, he will deliver us. And it may not be here on this earth. It would be nice if we were back at the garden and nobody sinned and nobody screwed up, or if Adam had taken responsibility in the moment and slapped Eve. I'm kidding. But, if he had stopped her, if she'd have taken a moment and gone and went, not to sit there and jump over to Genesis in the middle of all this, but there's actually no indication that Adam was standing right there in front of her. He was nearby somewhere in the garden, but she did what she did, and I don't think he was there. I think he was around the corner, or, he was over fussing with a tree that you were allowed to touch. So she's over here staring at the thing you're not supposed to, and that's when the devil tempted her. But either way, when he came over and realized that she had done this, she could have told the serpent no. He could have told her no. He could have been like, put that down now. And then on top of all that, when everything happened, they could have looked at God and said, we're sorry, please forgive us. It didn't happen anywhere in all that. And so we are where we are now, again, because they didn't take responsibility for their actions, but because they didn't stop and seek forgiveness. But even if that had never happened and we were in the garden, that's where man was meant to be for eternity. Eden was meant to be an eternal place. It's a representation, chasing a rabbit here. Eden, and this is why I think Eden, before the flood and everything, was in the Mount Zion area in Jerusalem. That's where God always chose to come down. Now, the tabernacle moved around. It was a tent that was portable, and they had to get 2 Israel. They had to get into the land of Canaan and take control. But that was their promised land to them by God. Why? Because that's his holy place. That's his holy hill on Mount Zion. I think that's where Eden was. Not a big deal if it was or it wasn't. But that was eternal. The human body, if we were to actually eat proper foods and live a proper life by God, I mean, yeah, Methuselah lived 960 plus years, right? Adam lived 950 years. Even at the point Noah lived almost 600 years. We can't make it past, 80 to 100, maybe 120 if you're lucky. If you're a Democrat on Social Security, you can live to be 300. But I'll save the political commentary for later. So, but the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him. And if you fear God, you're going to obey his commandments. If you're going to obey his commandments, you're going to have salvation. And God's going to preserve you. So to wrap all this up, verses 20, 21, and 22, verse 20, our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart is glad in him because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you. There is no name under heaven by which man must be saved than that of Jesus the Christ. There's no other way to heaven. It's not all roads get to heaven. They might take you to Rome, but they're not going to take you to heaven. It's not a bunch of different religions are going to get you there. The path is narrow. It's not broad. So the only way to get there is through God. And the only way to get to God is through Jesus. And I thank God that he shed his blood and made that path for us to have access to God through him. But we should be glad in that. And then we should trust, and that's part of being upright and being righteous, is trusting in the Lord. So even when you have those struggles, you lose your job, you financial issues, government goes crazy, the world goes crazy, somebody, violence, attacks, storms hit, name it, it's going on right now. Our nation is seeing all kinds of stuff happen. And part of it's government, part of it's nature, part of it might be space aliens. At least that's what they'll try to tell you. But if we trust in the Lord and we go to him for our salvation, doesn't mean that you're like the guy on the roof. Flood comes, right? Rainstorms come and they tell you it's going to be a flood. The rain's going to come in, it's going to flood everything. And the water begins to rise. So the guy gets on his roof and guy drives by in a giant jacked up 4x4, which typically they drive like jerks. But the guy drives by in a 4x4, stops, says, "Hey, hop in the truck, let's go." "Oh no, God's going to save me." Waters get higher, truck's gone, boat comes by. But hey, come on, get in the boat. "Oh no, God's going to save me." Boat goes on, helicopter flies by. "Hey, come on, let's pull you up, let's get you out of here." "Oh no, God's going to save me." Standing before the throne of God and, "God, why didn't you save me?" "Well, dude, I sent you a weather report, I sent you a truck, I sent you a boat, and I sent you a helicopter."
That's right.
And you rejected every one of them. And so many people on this earth are going to be doing that. Despite our best efforts, and I wish and hope and pray that every person we go out here in these neighborhoods and these houses and we talk to them and we witness to them, I hope and pray every single one of them find that salvation if they don't already have it, and if they do have it, that they get back on track with it. But that doesn't mean they're going to. And I love what I've been told in the past is, and a brother Roy over there at Lowrytown, and God told him this directly one time. He said, early in his ministry, "Stop seeking my results. We're to go out and spread the word and let God handle the rest of it." But the only reason any of that works is because his love is steadfast. It doesn't change. It's not a angry God in the Old Testament and a loving God in the New Testament. It's a loving Father through the whole entire thing. And part of that is discipline. Part of that is love. Part of that is nurturing. Part of that is caring. But we all want to deny. We don't want to take responsibility for our mistakes, and we don't want to be judged, and we don't want to be dealt with. But because of his steadfast love, he's constant and consistent. When we're off, we're bouncing all over the place from one day to the next because we don't focus on him.